Most of you have traveled to the Cape, and if you can conjure up in your mind where the elbow of the Cape is, that's where Monomoy Islands is present. It's comprised of better than 2,000 acres, which translates to about 1,317 hectares. A little bit south of Massachusetts, and it's actually two barrier islands, North and South Monomoy. At one time, it was a spit of land. And the other thing, too, about this presentation, there's going to be a fair amount of redundancy. I'll be repeating myself. Back in 1958, there was a severe storm in April of that year that breached that spit near the northern portion of the area, and by doing so, destroyed the most mature community, the community at Inward Point. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a map of Monomoy Islands, and I have to say that my colleague Eric, who as I speak is probably winging his way out to Colorado to do some botanizing out there, Eric wasn't satisfied with this map, and he's hired somebody to produce a better one. But if you can visualize this area up here, where I'm pointing to the breach, that was where the storm of '58 separated, pardon me, that's even farther up. That was a severe nor'easter of February 6th and 7th, 1978 that breached the island. The storm of '58 up near Morris Island is what separated the spit from the mainland. Some of these other sites, Powder Hole, maybe you can see this little station pond, where the lighthouse is. These are some of the areas that I'll mention very, very briefly in the presentation this morning. Also over here, a little bit farther, to my left, or to your right, which be a better area of where Cape Cod is and where the position of Monomoy Islands happen to be. Next slide, please. I mentioned something about this earlier, that the island was a spit extending from Morris Island. The blizzard of '78 separated the island into two islands and also destroyed the most mature community that at Inward Point. A little bit later on in the presentation, there's certain taxa that were found by, okay, let's see if we can get this right. Yes, 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 yes. That destroyed the most mature plant community, which was the woodland thicket, which was described by Mowell in 1969. And so there are a number of species that were once present at Monomoy that are not present today. Next slide, please. So what is the objective of this presentation? It's just to describe and prepare a list of the vascular plant species of the island. And then the other interesting one was to compare the species present today with those present at several northeast coastal sites, and then maybe as important, to compare our study with those of several earlier investigators that date back to 1954. Next slide, please. Geological history. It should be blatantly obvious right now is that all of these barrier islands have an active geological history. Severe storms, such as the April storm of '58 and the blizzard. Some of you who live in Boston might remember that blizzard of '78. I believe a gust of wind of 103 miles an hour or 105 miles an hour hit Logan Airport in Boston. And if you can also go back to previous years, '76 and '77, '77, '78, we had some very, very severe winters in the Northeast, but maybe not quite as bad as those that you Bostonians experienced this past February. Next slide, please. So this gives you an overview of what the island looks like. A lot of euthanias, which we used to call goldenrods, and I guess we still call them goldenrods. Old dune systems. And one thing that's conspicuously absent over here are trees. There are not really very, very many trees, nor much woody vegetation here at Monomoy. And in fact, better than 80% of the taxa here are non-woody or herbaceous. Next slide, please. And this is another overview. You can see that there are these low-lying wetlands or pools, ephemeral pools. There are also many bogs that support Vaccinium acrocarpon or cranberry. Also an abundance of Drosera intermedia, sundews. And this gives you a pretty good idea of what Monomoy looks like. A lot of sand, a lot of interdunal wetlands, a lot of non-woody vegetation, and the area is really not very floristically rich. Next slide, please. A little bit of information about the climate. It should be blatantly obvious, being where it's located, that it's going to be milder than an area like Chatham. Many of you have probably been to Chatham if you've driven on the Cape, and certainly a good bit milder in the summer than Boston, rarely having temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and rarely would it get down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter. Next slide, please. How did I get out to the island? An interesting, I would get up at about midnight to 1 o'clock, because I live in Long Island, New York. Drive 6 hours, and then get in touch with Dave Brownlee, who's the refuge manager, and I made arrangements, of course, and he or his associates would carry me over to Monomoy and drop me off, and then pick me up in the afternoon, and I would botanize the island. As far as the classification of plant species, this is by the manual of Haynes. Those of you who are familiar with Gray's Manual of Botany, 8th edition, published in 1950, or Gleason and Cronquist, 2nd edition in 1991, there are a huge number of changes here. For example, the Salicornias, the glassworts that used to be in the Chenopodiaceae family are now in the Amaranthaceae family. And just as this island is in a state of flux, so is or are the phylogenetic relationships of various taxa here. Rare plants, probably the rarest species that we found here was Polygonum glaucum. Only a few individuals of the sea beach knotweed were found here. And I can remember finding my first specimen about 100 meters from the site where, fortuitously, we happened to put in on one of the first visits. Next slide, please. So, from 2010 to 2012, during the growing season, is when I went up to Monomoy to sample the vegetation. For some of you who've done any botanizing, perhaps, and perchance the best time to sample any area, if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, is late summer or early fall. Eric and I, for example, sampled Plum Island, not Massachusetts, which you people are probably more familiar with, but Plum Island, New York, the USDA's Animal Disease Research site. We came up with almost 300 different vascular plant species on our first foray there in September, because that's probably the best time. We only picked up, I think, 414 different taxa there, so we found better than 70% of what we ultimately collected on one trip. Next slide, please. So, Haynes was the manual that we used to classify our vegetation. Next slide, please. And now taking a quick look at the results and discussion. 285 taxa. Now that's not what we collected, but this is the total number of species collected by all the investigators that really date from about 1932 to the present. Introduced species numbered only 58. That's a rather small percentage, roughly about 20%. Next slide, please. What we've done over here, and this is what will not be present in the paper that was submitted to Rodora, is a comparison of non-native and obviously native species in various coastal islands. Plum Island, New York, Gardiner's Island, New York. And note over here, at Gardiner's Island, and Gardiner's Island is occupied by one individual, the 16th or 17th Earl, now deceased, a Gardner. And unfortunately, people, I think what they're going to do is ultimately develop this area. Now, why the huge difference in the total number of species, say, between Plum Island and Monomoy Island? Parts of Gardiner's Island are forested, and that's huge. Parts of Gardiner's Island actually are maintained as gardens or whatever. And so that would account, and this actually is probably a low number, because this number of species was taken from a study that was mostly done during the summer and fall. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that we do a comparison of those who sampled the flora between 1954 and 2012. The Cross and Cross study is mentioned because it was probably the first botanical foray to the area. Note that they only came up with 69 different taxa. Massachusetts Audubon followed with 184. This was done in 1972, and the importance about this date is this was 6 years prior to the devastating nor'easter of February 6th and 7th, 1978, that destroyed the most mature community at the site. Lordy et al., and these people did an excellent job. In fact, their work was actually published in Rodora back in 1991. Came up with 178 different taxa, and if you look at their original paper, it'll have more than 178 taxa, but what we've done is, remember, whose classification scheme are we using? We're using Haynes, 2011, and there are changes, and that partially accounts for the different numbers in this paper and their original paper. And then the present study, we came up with 177. Now, my apologies. I can see the clock up there, but how much more time do I have?
Got 5 more minutes.
I have 5 more minutes. Terrific. Okay, next slide, please. This is another interesting table, interesting maybe just for me. Here are a number of coastal islands. Block Island, people are familiar with, Cuttyhunk Island, Fisher's Island, which is in New York, Gardiner's Island, Martha's Vineyard, and Monomoy Island. Total species richness. And note over here that Monomoy, although Monomoy is better than 1,000 hectares, is not really very, very floristically rich. And the reason for that is perhaps the dynamic nature of that island. There are no trees or forests or maritime forest communities there. There's some red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, a little bit of beach plum, Prunus maritima. I mentioned Ilex opaca and Amelanchier, but there's really not that many tall woody plants there. The fact that the area was separated from the mainland by a storm back in April of 1958, and the fact that the most mature community, the one at Inward Point that's now where the breach in the island exists, that points up to the relatively low number of species here compared to the other islands. And then with the next table, there's another explanation for all of this. Next slide, please. Human population. Monomoy Islands, 0. Now the area was populated. In fact, people lived there in the early 1700s as a fishing village. I won't bother to go into the history of the area, but in fact it was actually used as a bombing range back in 1944 as a Coast Guard station. but the last people have been off the island since about the 1960s. And that probably accounts for the small number, both in numbers and percentage, of non-native taxa that are present here. And here's Gardner's Avenue. Oh, Gardner's Avenue, my apologies. Gardner's Avenue is one of the main roads near my home on Long Island. Another senior moment, people, my apologies. So, next slide, please. We're just about to summarize this. So, to conclude, the number of taxa, the number of vascular plant species, has remained virtually unchanged over the last 40 years or so. Natural events, such as the storms that I've mentioned, and if any of you have ever been out to Monomoy, you can see how that island is being continually moved and sculptured by wind, waves, and more. Community development or succession also plays a role. For example, I only found my Spiranthes cernua in only one specimen on the path to the lighthouse. Only encountered this once, just once, and yet had been reported by a number of other investigators. And serendipity, another plant, Bartonia, I mentioned in a member of the Gentianaceae family. Little diminutive plant, if any of you are familiar with it. It's fairly common, noted as rare by the few previous investigators who found it, but its diminutive size would probably account for its rare status. Though human visitation is minimal, people like myself, refuge people, and I was speaking with an individual this morning who said that they've actually been out there and visited Monomoys, people who like to go out and watch the seals and so on and so forth, may be a possible source of seeds to the island, enabling new species to become established. So I think I've probably run out of time, and if there's any time for a few questions, I'll be glad to entertain them. Thank you. Yes?
You mentioned the constancy of species numbers. Is the identity of the non-native species also constant, or have you had replacements, some going out and others coming in?
Okay, the question is, I mentioned that the number of species has remained fairly constant. What about the turnover of non-native species? The turnover of non-native species has been considerable. And it's been considerable because, remember, until the 1960s, the site was occupied. There was an active Coast Guard station there. Mallel, for example, who published his work in 1969, found a number of non-native taxa that we did not find. Lordy et al. Had mentioned a pear and apple trees that were planted around old habitations. They were not present when we were there. I was fortunate enough and searched out and found a little diminutive mustard, Drabaverna, in the vicinity of the old Coast Guard station, just at that one spot. So yes, there's been continual turnover of non-native species. They're probably less frequent or fewer of those than they were today, and probably a bigger turnover of non-native taxa than that of native vascular plant species. Yes?
I'm interested in the rare species you found, Polygonum glaucum, which tends to be a more southern species. Were there early historical records that you found, or is this a recent?
Okay, the question is, what about Polygonum glaucum? The questioner made the statement that Polygonum glaucum is a more southern species. I found several populations only consisting of a few individuals at the area. And I'll mention something too about Polygonum glaucum. A number of years ago there was and I apologize because I've forgotten which hurricane it was, but it savaged the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And we did have a moderate effect in the vicinity of New York. In the area of the Rockaways in Fort Tilden, The year after that hurricane, the area was absolutely flooded with Polygonum glaucum. You found it in areas where you wouldn't normally find it, in dunes that would normally not be experience any tidal flooding. But like the ephemeral species that it is, it was in and out, and that was it. Yes?
Excuse me, Plum Island, off Long Island there, do you, as others do, attribute the relatively high diversity to lack of deer?
Okay, the question is, Plum Island, in Plum Island, New York, which is located off the, if you think of Long Island, North Fork, Plum Island, Big Gull Island, Little Gull Island, the lack of deer. Bambi actually gets out to Plum Island. In one of my early trips, I noticed that the Juniperus virginiana, the red cedar, had been browsed. Bambi is an excellent swimmer. Bambi also can go over fences, a 6-foot fence. A 6-foot fence, if anybody has read the Yearling. There's no barrier. There's no barrier to Bambi. But if Bambi gets over to Plum Island, it's a non-habit forming kind of mistake because of the noxious disease organ like anthrax, just to mention one. So they actually go out and actively shoot and incinerate any deer who's made a mistake about getting over there. Because yes, there are no deer most of the time, but occasionally they'll swim over there. Bad mistake. Bad mistake. Not habit forming.
And the diversity?
Diversity at probably for me the most interesting plant that I found at Plum Island was Silene caroliniana. That was an interesting plant because I've seen one population on the outer banks of North Carolina. But again, not much marsh vegetation. I mean, freshwater marsh vegetation, yes. Brackish marsh, no. And now I believe it's time to put the curtain down on me because it's 10:30 and time for a break.
It's a break time, so grab some coffee if you have.